Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I am here with my husband, Sush.
Hello.
And we are going to be doing a wrap-up of Space Opera September. Space Opera September is a readathon that is hosted by Thomas at SFF 180. I will link all the information about the readathon below. Both of us read books for Space Opera September, and we actually both completed all of the challenges. So that's pretty spectacular and slightly unexpected for me, given that I had a busy reading month. Because I have already talked about all of the books that I read for Space Opera September in some of my weekly wrap-ups, here I'm gonna only briefly mention the kind of main plot lines and my thoughts about each of the books. But since Sush hasn't talked about his thoughts about the books that he's read anywhere else, he's probably going to go into a bit more depth on the ones that he read. After we talk about the books we read for each of the challenges, we'll talk about some of the themes that we noticed as well as our top recommendations. The first challenge for Space Opera September was to read a space opera novella. For this challenge, I read On a Red Station Drifting by Aliette Bodard. This novella takes place in the Shuya universe that Aliette Bodard has created, which is sort of like a Vietnamese culture-inspired future sci-fi empire. And in this universe, there are some rebels that are fighting against the main empire, and due to those rebels, the main character is forced off of her home planet, and she goes to a space station. And when she joins the space station, she has some distant relatives who are there, and they kind of take her in, but she has a lot of conflict with them because the leader of that space station has a very different idea of how things should be run. So this space opera really does take place at a space station, so that was excellent. It has great ideas of space empires. It has a really interesting Vietnamese culture. I also really liked there were some curious ideas related to this. So in this culture, poetry plays a big part, and they will recite poetry, they do calligraphy, and tea is a big deal. So lots of interesting aspects related to, I think, traditional Vietnamese culture, as well as interesting space ideas. So for example, in this world, they have memories of ancestors which are implanted in their brains so that they can access the wisdom and advice of some of their ancestors. They also have a sort of a sentient AI type of being which runs the space station. So lots of cool sci-fi. I didn't so much like that there were some just kind of nasty behaviors by the people in the story, so that part got a bit to me, but I did really enjoy the space opera aspect of this book.
For my novella, I read To Be Taught of Fortunate by Becky Chambers. And this book, I think for me, lots of people have had various kinds of opinions on this, and for me, what it hit was one of wasted potential, I'm afraid. This had the potential to be the book of the year for me, and then it didn't quite deliver. And there's so many things that I thought the book did so well, and a few things that it didn't, and that frustrated the hell out of me. So there's a couple of ideas around the book, essentially, that I think informed how I saw the book. And one of it is a notion of, insect metamorphosis. And basically in like page 3, the narrator talks about how insects go through different phases of life. And she talks about how basically you start off as a caterpillar, you kind of feed yourself silly, and then you go into a cocoon and melt yourself and kind of go through metamorphosis and then come out as a moth. And essentially for me, this was a really, really powerful metaphor for how the book is structured. So in that sense, I didn't realize it as I was reading that portion, but then every time something would happen in the book, I would think back to this, and it informed the lens with which I viewed the book. And this is part of what made the book so powerful in a sense. Then there's also this notion of essentially like therapy for people who've been through trauma. And it talks about essentially, it doesn't talk about, but in therapy for people with trauma, you hear about this notion of a new normal, that trauma changes you fundamentally, and about how when you're trying to basically, find a healthy, stable state, you can't go back to what you were before the trauma. You have to find a new you that is stable.
Like the metamorphosis.
Like the metamorphosis. And so for me, these two tie in really strongly with each other. And it's like the moth can't wish itself back to being a caterpillar. It used to be a caterpillar, but it is no longer. And so for me, this kind of set the tone essentially for how I saw the book and read the book. Then there's also one more thing that I want to mention at the outset, which is my experience with a game that I played a few years back called No Man's Sky. And No Man's Sky was a game that was really talked up a lot. There was a lot of hype around it. And in a sense, it was about space exploration. It's like you go out there, you're alone on a planet and you're discovering the various flora and fauna for everything around you. And it's just this wide-eyed wonder of you exploring space. And it had the potential for so much there, where I really, really enjoyed the first week and a half of playing this. And it's like when you initially start off on a planet, you're afraid to go too far away from your spacecraft, and you're afraid of, running out of oxygen, things getting too hot, or, what if you meet some animal that is going to try and eat you, or, that sort of a thing. And so you're a little careful initially, you really map out the places close to you, and then you slowly start expanding out. You really enjoy the planet, you see what's there, and you kind of just explore. And that is so much fun. And then what happens is you finally gather enough resources to kind of leave this planet, and then you go to the next planet. And the thing is, this planet has a lot of new stuff, but in a general meta pattern way, it's not that different. And then you go to the next planet, and then the next planet, and then there is nothing except just discovery for the sake of discovery, cataloging for the sake of cataloging. What is the point of this?
Science.
It is science, but then does that actually feed back into anywhere? And there is, I felt with No Man's Sky, a sense of hopelessness and kind of a sense of where is the new gameplay past this? And I felt similar themes in this book. Okay, and so it's kind of to me the two are very heavily linked. And so now coming back to the book itself, the book basically divides itself off into 4 planets. And in the first planet, there's this joy of discovery, and it's like everything is new. Oh my God, there is life kind of feeling about things. And it's kind of like they're digging in and they're being themselves. They're lost in the joy and the disbelief that things are happening. And then the second planet they go, life abounds. It's like there's a plethora of life. If there was only small bits in the thing that they were really excited by, in planet 2 it's kind of like an overload. And also there's a bunch of things about kind of just like you have the notion of terraforming, there's a notion of soma forming, where you transform yourself to suit the planet. And the second planet, they become much more muscular because of the heavy gravity, which then leads to them being more physical, more in tune with their bodies and that sort of a thing. And so they're just gorging themselves on life. And then when they come to planet 3, circumstances require them to basically become hermits and shut in, and they cocoon themselves, so to speak. And everything is horrible. And each individual character, all the things that make them them, all the things that basically are their strengths, become their weaknesses in planet 3. And so it's so fascinating. It's really, really good that way. And then there's planet 4, where they're supposed to be moths. This is supposed to be a brand new day. Everything is open again, and this is the new life form that you become. And while there are certain things that happen which are explored really neatly, for me it was like nothing. The planet 4 onwards was such a letdown. There was nothing. It was like there was supposed to be a planet 4, and then there wasn't. Like in terms of the metamorphosis kind of experience, they weren't moths. And in a sense, the open-endedness of the story that basically a lot of people had a problem with. I had a issue before I hit that point, to a point where I had disconnected. And if I were to draw the metamorphosis example to the thing, essentially the choices that are made are sort of like they decide that they're not a moth, or they don't want to be a moth.
So they just hang out in their chrysalis the whole time?
They decide to kind of go back into a cocoon to postpone for future.
Wow.
So it's kind of like that,
not satisfying.
That was not satisfying. And I think that's where I feel like this could have been so much better. It was yeah.
The second challenge was actually broken up into two versions. So there's a 2A and a 2B. Sush actually did both 2A and 2B, although I only did 2B. So first we'll go with him. 2A was to read 2 space operas by women.
And while I have others that qualify as well, the one that I'm choosing for this, listing is A Closed in Common Orbit by Becky Chambers. And so basically...
Oh, and plus the previous one he mentioned, plus some other ones, that makes up the 2.
Yeah. In all this, too. So A Closed in Common Orbit by Becky Chambers was book 2 of the Wayfarers trilogy. I read book 1 and book 3 when reading up for the Hugos, but I skipped past 2 because it wasn't chronologically required. And so I went back and read book 2. And I guess, again, I come down to narrative structure, I think, with Becky Chambers. If book 1 was kind of on the lines of a series of short stories, like, say, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, kind of a thing, and book 3 had a few main characters that it kept rotating between. So you go A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D. Book 2 goes A, B, A, B, A, B, where there are 2 primary characters, and one of them is being told about the current timeline, and another is basically flashbacks to the past of one of the other characters. I love this book. I think for me, this is my favorite book of the Wayfarers trilogy. And I think I had issues again with some of the very neat tying up of stories in the other 2 books, which I felt like it wasn't forced in this book. I really liked the characters there. The struggles that they went through, I was totally drawn in. And basically, I guess I should also start by mentioning that I really like one thing about Becky Chambers' characters. Even if they are a little one-dimensional because of this thing, I really like that aspect of the thing, which is that all the characters are really kind.
Yeah, yeah.
It's kind of like they're really considerate, they really take care of other people, and they, even if they have their moments of kind of like, separation, they after they kind of have some time, they try to reconnect, and they're basically really kind to each other. They're kind of the people that you want to be around, in a sense, or at least I want to be around. And so basically, I think that really works for me for most part, and it didn't feel forced in this book. There was a bit of exploration of a bunch of communities, about feeling alien in a community that is still welcoming, and the issues of body dysmorphia essentially that are kind of explored. And I think the notion of how even being kind can kind of still alienate you, I think, was explored a little bit. And there's also, I think, one more miscellaneous thing I'll throw in there is for people that are not used to tattoos and things like that. It at least explores one approach as to why people might want to get tattoos, and in a sense it also looks a little bit into alt culture in a sense. And so a lot of these is really nice explorations, and that's all I'll say about the book without spoiling anything.
The other option for this challenge was 2B, which was to read a book featuring a diverse character written by a diverse author. So for this, I chose to read A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine, who is queer, and the main character is also queer. This story is, again, this kind of epic grand space opera. It takes place in an empire called the Teixcalan Empire, and features an ambassador from a small mining station, LaSalle Station, who goes there. It actually is a murder mystery because she is trying to discover what happened to her predecessor who died under very mysterious circumstances on that station. It really explores a lot of interesting ideas of what an empire is, of how memory works. Similar to On a Red Station Drifting, in this book, people from LaSalle Station have little machines implanted in their head that contain the memories of their predecessors. And so they are able to access their predecessors' skills and knowledge, although hers has become malfunctioning, which really handicaps her in this very complicated empire where there's a lot of political intrigue. So this book was a lot of fun. It also had very interesting science, explored some interesting ideas related to empires and memory, as the title may suggest, and it was just a very good read.
For me, for Tubi, I read Hexarchate Stories by Yoon-Ha Lee, and basically, I think the way I would talk about this is that if you really enjoyed Machineries of the Empire, I can definitely recommend this for you. It's not something that I think everyone who reads Machineries of the Empire must read, but I think that if you are invested in the world and want a bit more, this is a good kind of continuation. And it feels sometimes a little bit like fan fiction set in the world, but just written by the author itself. There's also, for example, there's way too much about geese. And that's based off just some one line in like a backdrop of a character. And it's overdone to a point where it's almost, fan servicey. Okay, so, and so basically I think that that's what I felt as kind of the primary. I enjoyed it thoroughly, but it's not something that I think everyone will care about. Now, having said that, the things that I think really work for me in this book is it's basically a collection of short stories, novelettes. I think there's a novella in there as well. And with each of these, there's like an author's note at the end. And the author's notes were brilliant. Having heard Yoon-Ha Lee at Worldcon, I was able to picture his voice in that, and that made it so much better. And I think there's this notion of him just having a ball writing some of these things that I think I really enjoyed. Then I think there's also a couple of stories. There was one story about robot math lessons, which I absolutely loved. I think there was a backdrop story. I mean, like 300 years, 400 years in the past or something like that, which is a Battle of Candelark that I thought was brilliant. There's a novella at the end which is set after the events of Machineries of the Empire, which for me didn't work for most of the part. I was just reading it. It was okay, sort of a thing. And then the ending brought it back really neatly. So it's kind of like this. I think there's a bunch of hit and miss in the stories, but if you are already a fan of Machineries of the Empire, I think this is very enjoyable.
But it wouldn't stand on its own if you hadn't read it. Yeah. Moving on to Challenge 3, which was to read a space opera written before you were born. So for this, both of us read Babel 17, which was published in 1966, and Sush read another book that was also published before he was born. So I'll go ahead and talk first. Babel 17 was just one of my favorite. I mean, I loved most of these reads, but it was really one of my favorites because it reached out and spoke to me. It was all about language and communication and culture and bridging cultural gaps and discovering the way that people think through the language that they use. Plus, it was a mystery, which was a lot of fun for me. So this story basically follows Roger Wong, who is a poet and a genius when it comes to language. her government asks her to decode messages written in something that they have termed Babel 17, and she goes on an adventure with a bunch of other people trying to discover what's going on with this language. So I had such a lot of fun with this story. I really liked those themes of language and communication, although it does get very abstract towards the end and can be a little bit difficult to follow. I just absolutely connected to it and loved it.
So, I also read Babel 17, and I had a very different reading experience from Shannon's. And I think it's only after Shannon finished the book and then she discussed certain points with me where I even realized that that was what was going on. And therefore it's like, oh, okay, that makes a little more sense, and that then makes a bunch of things follow through a little better. So I think that, actually, let me go into the thing. I think the book starts off really strong for me. I think the first quarter of the book, where she's assembling the crew and things like that, was my favorite bit, because there is so much world building and character building that is going on just behind the scenes. That is what I really, really liked. I also think that if you consider that this book was published in 1966, and that kind of puts it in as a contemporary of the original Star Trek series, and the original Star Trek series was lauded and as something which is groundbreaking from a perspective of diversity and things like that.
This is way more diverse.
It's like you use a modern lens on yeah. So there are some things that it does really, really well, and it's really impressive. And in general, I think your wrap-up does a good justice of this. So, of all the good parts of the thing. So, I'm going to add on for a bunch more things that didn't work for me.
It's okay, but, I mean, there may be some distance between us.
So, I think I'd mentioned this kind of a problem when I talked about Machineries of the Empire way back with the Hugo things itself, where I sometimes felt like I was a passive observer, where the story was just being told to me and I didn't have any way of predicting where it might go. And I was just listening and going, okay, kind of a thing. I felt that much more strongly here. And unlike with Machineries of the Empire, where I was drawn in, I felt like with Babel 17, it lost me somewhere through around a third of the, of the book. And so basically it was like I was hearing facts and things were happening and I didn't necessarily know where things were going or what was going on. So that I think was something that basically detracted from the reading experience a lot for me. The other thing I think, again, as a comparison with Yunha Lee, was the central conceit of the magical system of the Machineries of the Empire, where they talk about the calendrical warfare and exotic systems and things like that. While I was able to kind of shelve my disbelief, for that kind of a thing, somehow the notion of a supremely analytical language didn't work for me. And that then meant that a lot of events, I just had to say, like, okay, I'll accept this as happening.
I wonder if it was like Uncanny Valley. You know what I mean? Where in Machineries of Empire, that calendrical warfare based on strength of belief is so far from kind of like what actually happens. Whereas in Babel 17, this idea of a highly analytical language is actually very related to what we have. It's almost more jarring to try to have that lead to unexpected results. So I bet that that's kind of part of it, where you understood this much more deeply, and therefore we're much more critical of the claims that were being made.
That's not how that works, or this is kind of like CSI's Enhance kind of a thing. I think that...
Although with neural networks, you can do the Enhance thing now, so maybe we're just not there yet.
Also, I read through Solaris by Stanislav Lem, and read through is kind of actually a little incorrect because I listened to the audiobook, but it wasn't an audiobook, because what it was a 2-hour BBC radio play, which means there's some very heavy production values going into it. There are different characters that are acting it out. There's music production, sound production, and and it's not the book itself. It's actually a dramatization of the book. So there is a little bit of distance from the book in that the source material in that sense. But as it turns out, that doesn't matter as much as it should, because according to what I read about this. This is a dramatization based on an English translation of a French translation of a Polish original.
I see.
So Stanislaw Lem wrote it in Polish. It was translated to French, and then a couple of people translated it to English.
From the French?
From the French. They were not working from the Polish version. And Stanislaw Lem, who apparently read English fluently, hated the English translation. The story has apparently been criticized a lot for a lot of its misuse of Freudian psychoanalysis and things like that, which apparently is true of the English translation, but is not true of the Polish original. Okay, so that made him still more frustrated at the thing. And apparently in 2011, after he died, there was a new English translation that's been attempted. And according to his wife and kids, this is a much more faithful translation. But because of some legal issues, that could not be printed, so it exists as an audible audiobook. So it's like, so what I'm getting into is, I guess, that I'm not going to try to criticize any of the language or the issues directly associated with what I saw, which is so many degrees removed from the original. Because with each translation, you add on additional biases of the people and the culture and the time that that work did. So yeah, that's the first note. If you want translated works, this counts in a big way, or shouldn't count in a sense. So anyway, the book basically. Is a very short book. It was it was only 2 hours, and it occurs on a space station called Solaris, orbiting a planet presumably also called Solaris. And basically there is a giant sentient ocean in this planet. The entire ocean is sentient, and there are scientists in the space station that are trying to observe the ocean. And on a daily basis, there's some activity that they're observing, and it's like these giant rise and fall of civilization and kind of feel to it. And the scientists are certain that the ocean knows that they are here spying on it, and that it is fighting back. So at the beginning of the book, there are supposed to be 3 scientists aboard the space station, and a 4th, the protagonist, arrives at the station to find 2 scientists over there pretty crazy, or at least he thinks they're crazy, and the 3rd one being dead, and he's trying to figure out what's going on. But at the same time, the book is told from a perspective of a record or notes that this 4th person is taking at the end of the events, and he constantly refers to things saying, well, but I can't report that. So which means that he has now gained further understanding, and he's putting down a faithful log before editing out what he's not going to send back. So there's definitely a mystery that is being solved. The world building, well, not world building, but the scenario setting is phenomenal. The mystery is very compelling, and a lot of what goes on there is actually really interesting. Without talking about what the mystery actually is, I will talk about the themes. And the theme is one of what is your deepest, darkest thoughts or self in your memory, where it's like people go through being respectable people in daily life, but they've had dark thoughts. What if some of those thoughts were made real somehow? How do you react to that?
Patronus.
So basically it's like, if that is then brought out, and your deepest secrets made visible to others, do you feel shame? Do you feel like, what do you say, those things are normalized? Do you feel like you retaliate? Do you try to, and sometimes your deepest, darkest thoughts can be like regret, in which case, do you now have a second chance? Okay, so these are the kinds of things that it tries to explore, which is a notion of what humanity is if those things are brought to life. And would you fight to kill that thing? Would you fight to retain that thing? Or would you simply ignore that thing? And this is what the book essentially explores. I found it insanely powerful for how short it is and for how quickly it sets everything up. This was brilliant.
And you really liked the production, right?
The production was phenomenal, and so I highly recommend it if you get a chance to. Although I do want to try and track down the 2011 translation to see how that goes. I don't know that I'm particularly interested in the old English translation, because if that's what is there, then I think the radio play is really good. But I want to see how something that is closer to the original would have been.
And lastly, challenge 4 was to read a space opera that was 500 pages or longer. For this, I read Lilith's Brood by Octavia Butler, which is a bind-up of the Xenogenesis series, which includes Dawn, Adulthood Rites, and Imago, and altogether it was 746 pages, so that definitely worked for this challenge. It was quite a challenge for me to finish this as well. The story is I don't know what to say. It is a deep and heavy story that really throws you for a loop, like I think a lot of Butler's works, but it also just had such impact and so many important themes in it. It follows humanity as an alien race comes and saves the remaining humans after a third world war in the 80s, where nuclear apocalypse kind of destroys most of the earth and most of the people. But the aliens take the remaining humans and they heal them and they fix the earth and give them a chance to live back on earth again. But the cost is that there has to be some genetic trade between these aliens and the humans. And there's a lot of themes of sort of what that means in terms of what does it mean to be human, what does it mean to accept this help, what does it mean to have this alien race that is way more advanced than humanity coming in and helping them. So tons of interesting stuff on this. We'll discuss a little bit of some of those themes later on when we talk about the themes we've seen in many of these different books.
On my end for this challenge, I read Cordelia's Honor by Louis McMaster Bujold. This is a bind-up of 2 books, the first one being Shards of Honor and the second one being Barayar. And before I talk about the books themselves, I guess some bit of backdrop setting is in order. And essentially this, of note are 2 colonies essentially of humans. This is well after humans have taken to space. And the 2 colonies of interest are the Beta Colony and Barayar. Beta Colony is kind of like a space California in a sense. Okay, I mean, it's kind of like it prioritizes technology. Okay, and apparently they're also weapons dealers. And it really prioritizes mental health and, you know, therapy and things like that. But you don't maybe have that much of a choice in that people be like, you know, you're obviously bad, let me fix you. Okay, or you're obviously feeling bad, let me fix you. Sorry, let me correct that. Or say, for example, they really heavily believe in egalitarianism and democracy, but in the military they can't even give orders because all your subordinates will be like trying to you know, give their opinions on the matter, and sometimes they will take it up to a vote and, you know, things like that.
Nothing gets done.
So yeah, so it's kind of like it's trying to poke fun at some of the aspects that make it good as well, in a sense. The author is trying to poke fun at some of those aspects as well. And by contrast, you have Barayar, and Barayar is a feudal militaristic place which has been isolationist for many centuries. So technologically speaking, it's comparatively backward. And it's all, but at the same time, they're very heavily military focused, and they're definitely focused on expansionism and things like that. They've only recently re-engaged with, the rest of space community. But also there's like this notion of, counts, and there's an emperor, and they have a society based on honor, and there definitely are strong sexist and classist underpinnings to all of it. And Barayar is undergoing change, but even the progressives of Barayar have quite a way to go, so to speak. Okay, so this is the backdrop in which we set things, and this story essentially follows two primary characters. Actually, one primary character, but the other one is pretty important too. Cordelia Naismith, who is basically from the Beta Colony, and R.L. Vorkosigan, who is, who's from Barayar. And if you look at the two books that form this binder, the first book is very much a romance. It's a romance, adventure, space opera. And there's a lot that goes into it, and it's thoroughly satisfying. It's got a lot of complexity, it's got a lot of depth. The characters are really well written, and there's just so much that's going on there. And in a sense, I guess there is also a little bit of mystery, which is, given their very different backgrounds, how do they end up together is definitely, a question. And so it's like, you can see it, but how does it get there? And then the story resolves that. And I think the thing that I really also like about it is that it resolves it in a way that is completely satisfactory. It doesn't feel shoehorned in. Mm-hmm. And the story is faithful to the characters and faithful to the worlds that they are from, and events ensue. And so I really like that. What is also interesting is, I think the name Shards of Honor for the first part is very well named, because it really explores a lot into what makes for honor. It's easy to say this is an honor-based society, but what does honor really mean? Who is honorable? What acts are honorable? What do you have to give up in order to remain honorable? And can you give up honor to be honorable? Okay, and it's like, it explores so many shades of this, and it's really well written. It was just thoroughly enjoyable to read. So if the first one was a romance, the second part is a political intrigue. So Barayar is basically kind of goes into the politics of Barayar itself, and basically you have various kinds of factions, and you have basically Cordelia, going to Barayar, and she brings with her a very Dayton view of looking at things, and so she riles up things that she doesn't realize is riling up, but at the same time she doesn't take shit from a whole bunch of people who think they can get away with things.
Like swearing on somebody's YouTube channel?
Oops. Okay. And so basically, I really, really like the characters. They work so much for me. And I think there's also a thing that I like here, which is, in a team there can be conflict between a couple of characters where, they can still work together as a team and kind of get closer to each other without resolving that primary conflict. And you can live with that, and you understand that this is irreconcilable. And
that reminds me a lot of that talk we went to about liking problematic things, where you can hold very different views at the same time, and sometimes there is value in being able to see all sides, even if,
And it's like, for that character, there is no redemption arc or kind of, bringing it together, yay team, sort of a thing.
This is not Becky Chambers?
No, this is not it. So basically, it is so well written. I think this goes into, again, one of my favorite books of all time. I think this is thoroughly enjoyable to read, and I would heavily recommend this.
Okay, so now that we have talked about all of the books that we finished for the challenges, we wanted to discuss just a couple of the themes that we noticed in these stories. The first theme that really stood out to me was language and poetry and the way that they are used. In Lilith's Brood by Octavia Butler, it was very interesting because each of the remaining humans came from, not each of them, but there were small groups from various language backgrounds. And what ends up happening is as they repopulate Earth, they kind of group together by language, and language ends up being something that isolates them as well as connects them to their own group. Additionally, Lilith, the main character of the first book, ends up learning the Oankali language, the language of the aliens, and that plays a key role in her understanding their culture and adapting to them. Similarly, On a Red Station Drifting, language plays a big role. Not just language, but poetry in particular plays a big role, where poetry is a big part of the Shuya culture, and it is used in very stylistic ways to convey very specific cultural and political meanings. And there is one scene in the book where poetry plays a vital, pivotal role in the plot. So poetry is a strong part of that culture, a strong part of conveying meaning. Very similar to that, in A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine, again, there's an empire that uses poetry. Poetry is not just a form of expression, but it is a form of control. It is a form of perpetuating the culture of the empire, conveying it, converting other people to it, passing down the memories of the empire. Poetry is very important for that empire, and it is used in a variety of ways. It is used not just as an artistic form, but also used very much as a political form, where it can incite people to riot, it can sway people into doing different things, it can really affect their actions, and it is even used as the way that they encrypt messages. They use kind of a variation on currently popular poems as their encryption method. Speaking of encryption, Babel 17. Babel 17 is so much about poetry, the main character is a poet, and language, especially language as a mysterious code. It is, the entire point of the book is that the main character, Raija Wong, is trying to decode Babel 17 to understand what it conveys. And here, it's not just that it is conveying messages that she needs to decode, but she has to also understand the people who wrote it and what they meant by it, what is kind of culturally found inside of the structure of the language itself. And she uses her poetry, she uses her language for so many other purposes in here besides just decoding messages. She uses her poetry to express the feelings and the experiences of the people of her time. She also uses it to affect people's actions. And she uses language as a way to bridge cultural gaps and to bring people together, and again, to influence them. So this idea of language and poetry as almost ways not just to understand, but also to influence are really big.
I think also one more thing to add to that, which is Hexarchate stories. The machineries of the Empire world is very much around a notion of conformity, and to which there is a notion of a high language that everyone is supposed to use. It's kind of like a common language, but it's also the language of all the poetry and things like that. You have undone poets and that sort of thing. It's the language of diplomacy, but it's also the standardized language, and anyone not speaking it is mocked or is considered an outsider or a heretic. And so even though it spans the universe with very diverse worlds, they're all forced to conform. Two primary characters that you see in the series, one Jadao is supposed to be a person that speaks with a drawl, and this is supposed to be kind of an intent that he is never fully assimilated. And so it's kind of he retains a portion of himself is kind of the expectation in a sense. And to contrast that, Charis, who's another primary character, she was apparently made fun of when she was a little girl because she had Wendell accent, and she learns to stamp it out and basically conform strictly to the high language and not show even one bit of her Venan heritage. But internally, privately, secretly, she's fiercely loyal to the heritage, maybe as a result of this, but also in general. So this notion of conformity and language as a medium for that is something that is spread through Hexakit stories.
Just a typical thing that is said, by the way, about the difference between a language and a dialect is generally a government and a military. In that language often is closely tied to the idea of nationality and some military might. And so it's often also used to impose belonging or not belonging. So that makes a lot of sense. Another theme that was really noticeable in a lot of the books that we read was the idea of the power of memory. In both On a Red Station Drifting and A Memory Called Empire, there were those machines that were implanted in people's heads that had either the ancestor or predecessor's memories, providing them with knowledge and skills and the ability to successfully navigate the world around them. That memory gave them kind of almost superhuman powers to be better than they were. Additionally, in both of those stories, there's this idea of culture as memory, where in both of them, poetry and stories of their own empire, of their culture, are continually told and continually passed down. Knowledge of that culture is used to sort of perpetuate the power of the empire, as well as, especially in A Memory Called Empire, to spread that to other places and really dominate through the power of those memories and that culture. In Lilith's Brood, memory plays a very interesting role. So there's kind of this interesting dichotomy between the way that the aliens act and the way that they force the humans to act. So in this, they have a very different sense of what's right and wrong and what values are. And they don't use writing, and they won't allow humans to write things down in the beginning. And so humanity is very much struggling because they're not allowed to write down their memories, they're not allowed to retain their culture. Whereas the aliens, on the other hand, they don't use writing, but they have a genetic form of passing down information, almost like the memory implant machines. They have a genetic way of doing that, such that the parents can pass down to the children generations upon generations of learned knowledge through these kind of genetic samples. And so each generation learns from all of those memories and gains a ton of power and skill through that passing down of memory.
And speaking of memory, in terms of Hexakit stories, one of the primary ideas behind the Machineries of the Empire series, how it starts off, is essentially that you have the memories of this general, Jadao, from 400 years back or something like that, and he is a supremely good strategist, and we're trying to restore his memories into a modern day general, Charis, to try and see if we can recreate kind of a thing. And a lot of events get set in place from that point on, which kind of starts asking the question of where does Charis end and Jadao begin, and vice versa. I'm not going to say more than that for spoilers reasons, and Hexakit Stories definitely expands a lot on this thing, but that is one of the foundational aspects of the entire series. Then another thing I'll mention is in Solaris, that is kind of the basic idea, that what do you keep hidden deep within you? And if something is able to reach in and materialize those thoughts, the notion of private versus public is definitely breached. There's also this notion of, it's like, who are you? Are these thoughts you? And that sort of a thing that are brought into the picture. So I think memory is a strong theme.
And the last theme that we want to talk about today is that of imperialism. If you haven't checked it out already, Bree from Bree Reads Books just did a video talking about imperialism in science fiction. So I will link that below. In it, she does a really good job of discussing this issue and how it has played a big role in science fiction's past, as well as just as a theme that comes up pretty frequently. So this played a role in a lot of stuff, and it makes sense because a lot of these space operas involve empires, and when you've got an empire, you often have imperialism. In On a Red Station Drifting, definitely the Shuya Empire is a big part, and in particular the rebellion within the Shuya Empire and the war that is being fought is a big background to what's going on, and it leads to a lot of the problems that are experienced. There's a lot of a sense that the empire is kind of rotting from within, and people are displeased with it, although even if they're still loyal, they don't like what's going on. They also experience a lot of deprivations because of this war, because of this empire, because of the kind of decline in the empire. So that's a big theme. Similarly, in a memory called Empire, there's this huge empire, the Tixkalan Empire, which is experiencing similarly some issues of rebellion and rot, as the emperor that is currently in power is very, very old. And so there's going to be a little bit of a power struggle trying to figure out who his successor is. That idea of an empire's strength and if it could be kind of degrading because the leadership isn't strong anymore or because other people are rebelling, that's a part of it. But there's also an idea of imperialism in terms of cultural imperialism, the spread of Tixkalan culture, the dominance of that culture. Because our main character in the story is Mahitz, who is the ambassador for LaSalle Station. And LaSalle Station is such a small entity that is struggling to keep its independence and not be consumed by the Tixkalan Empire. This is a big theme. She is trying to retain her identity as a person from LaSalle Station, but also having to navigate the politics and adapting to the court of the Tixkalan Empire. And so that kind of difficulty with maintaining your own culture while also dealing with this imperial culture that is trying to impress itself upon you and take away your stuff is kind of big. Lilith's Brood is all about imperialism. I mean, that is the core of what this book is about. It's about an alien culture coming in, thinking that it knows better, deciding that its values are superior to yours, forcing you to conform. And I think that Octavia Butler does some really interesting things in this book because she takes what commonly happened for many, many centuries by Western powers that went to other parts of the globe, colonized and kind of enforced imperial rule on the people there with complete disregard for their own cultures, their own values, their own beliefs. And she flipped that so that really every human is now experiencing that that experience of being the subjugated people who are not in power and they're facing a superior might. I think also because the aliens are not, in a sense, intentionally hurting humans, they just find themselves superior. They, in many ways, think that they are helping out humanity, they're saving humanity. So it draws a lot of parallels to Western missionaries who would go to other countries and be like, I'm doing, God's work and I'm helping people and all these sorts of things. But the consequences of their actions were often very, very negative. So there's a lot of parallels to imperialism in many of these books.
And a lot of what you're mentioning, I have the same things because this is the common theme as I see it. Basically, if you want to look at machineries of the empire, I mean, that's what it's all about in terms of enforcing your will, enforcing your norms on heretics, as they call. If you look at Cordelia's honor, I talked about Barayar basically being a political intrigue. It's because there is an old emperor and that's kind of what a lot of Barria's modern changes are about. And it's kind of like, I think these kinds of themes generally run across a lot of these stories. I did want to dig a little bit further into To Be Taught and Fortunate, because a lot of what you're saying is also covered in here, but framed slightly differently. One of their core goals in To Be Taught and Fortunate is this notion of soma forming. It's like, let's not terraform a planet, let's change ourselves so that we have minimal impact on that planet, right? But there are other living creatures in that planet. So it's their planet, you're going there, right? Now, so the question is, even exploring, even the minimal contact has effects. And are you okay with that? What is that going to cause? And you're trying to minimize the impact, but you're okay with having an impact. Okay? So, and there is a tale, a Harmagian's tale kind of a thing that is told in A Record of a Spaceborne Few, which is modernized and adapted in To Be Taught If Fortunate, where there's a particular conversation about between a couple of the characters, and it talks about, it's like, do you, open a rock, like lift up a rock and look at the worms underneath the rock. It's like, the worms don't like sunlight. You just expose them, and they are not going to be happy about that, and they probably feel pain from that. Are you okay with imposing pain to them? And the reasoning seems to be, it's like, well, if we didn't know that the worms felt pain from this, we would open up rocks all the time, and then we would cause a lot more pain to a lot more worms. So we should open up the rocks, study the worms, figure out if they feel pain or not, and then because we know now not to be much worse, let's try and moderate how we affect our thing. So the idea being that the pain of a few is acceptable sacrifice for knowledge of that helps the greater. But then the other character contracts to this, saying, I buy knowledge is important, and having a smaller, greater impact is important, but you can only call it sacrifice if it was consensual. Okay? And so I think the idea is that this is a lot more palatable and easy to see when you're talking about worms and you're talking about, rocks and things like that, or even if you're talking about alien beings that you're not, sure are sentient, in a different planet. But when you start applying that to other human beings, you see some of the problems. And then I think the idea is that, can you then take those problems that you see when you do apply it to human beings and apply it to the alien creatures or the worms or whatever else? And so I think that is an interesting exploration that happens over there. Also, the name of the title of the book, To Be Taught If Fortunate, is actually from a quote, and I'm going to read out from here because there's no way I'm going to remember. Basically, apparently, a quote from Kurt Waldheim, who was a former UN Secretary General, based on a part of something that is recorded on the Voyager probe as it went out. And it goes, we step out of the solar system into the universe, seeking only peace and friendship, to teach if we are called upon, to be taught if we are fortunate. And so, and the notion that this marks, it is a marked separation from prior efforts at colonization and things like that, where there was no question of being taught, it's only to spread and enforce. There is a little bit of humility that is kind of part of this. But then I want to bring in Solaris, which questions that humility in the first place and says, we may pretend to have lofty goals and we may pretend to have high ideals, but what we really want is essentially a mirror to show us that, oh, we're doing well, oh, we're great, sort of a thing. And it's like, are your high ideals really high, kind of a thing, is something that Solaris brings into this.
Yeah. Okay, so as the last thing before we wrap this up, you can see it's getting pretty dark outside. We have taken our time with recording this. We wanted to recommend our favorites out of what we read this month, or really the thing that we would recommend other people read. For me, the book that I would recommend the most is A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine. I think that out of all of the books that I read, this is the one that is likely to have the broadest appeal. It really has a ton of cool world building that I think would appeal to anybody who likes speculative fiction. It has really interesting science fiction, such as the Imago memory machines. It also is an excellent mystery, so even for somebody who doesn't read speculative fiction, they might enjoy reading this and getting to experience that mystery. It has a lot of curious, important themes, and it's just a very fun read, so that's my recommendation.
For me, Cordelia's Honor has to be it. I think this is something I can recommend without qualifications. It's really good. It's got great characters, great world building. The romance is really believable and good, and the politics is interesting. It's solid. Just read it.
So that wraps up Space Opera September for us. If you have read any of the books that we have read, please leave your comments down below. We'd love to hear what you thought, or if you participated in Space Opera September, please let me know so that I can go ahead and check out your video as well.